In this story, I'm going to tell you how the men in my golf group turned a family tradition into a campaign to push me out snide texts, whispered jabs, and one night my golf bag slashed. But I'm not going to show you a shouting match or a messy confrontation. I used quiet, precise moves, documentation, the club's own rules, and a formal review to make their petty cruelty unravel on paper. Stay with me and I'll walk you through exactly what I recorded, who I contacted, and how I turned small, everyday humiliation into a meticulous, devastating vindication. My name is Maya Caldwell. I am 29 female and I live in Portland, Oregon, in a third-floor apartment that smells faintly of rain and coffee every time I come home. I am the kind of person who keeps a battered notebook in the front pocket of my bag, who organizes playlists for long runs along the Willamette, who waters an overenthusiastic fiddle leaf fig on my fire escape. I work in user experience design and I am deliberate about details, the right shade of gray for a button, the cadence of a micro-interaction. These small habits are anchors. They make the world legible when human behavior does not. For years, golf was my release. I picked up the game because my father loved it, because the ritual of an annual round robin with 3 men at the country club had been a slow, laughing tradition for as long as I can remember. The ritual itself felt like inheritance. The clink of clubs into a bag he'd had since before I was born, the smell of sunscreen and cut grass, the predictable cadence of banter that landed softer the more you had listened to it. We all showed up every season. The ritual of a scorecard, the same tired snacks in a cooler, the crude jokes that landed only because they had been told for years and no one bothered to update them. I was the worst player of the four, and I liked it that way. Being bad meant I could be a foil. Being the foil let jokes bounce off me like wind off a canyon wall. I could lose a hole, laugh it off, and feel the press of wind on my face as if that cleared whatever small anxieties I carried. This past season, things changed. I practiced in the early dawns, grinding on drives, trying new techniques, watching slow-motion videos of my swing and fixing what I could. I started writing notes not about technique alone, but about feeling, where my tension lived, how my breath betrayed me on certain holes, how the weight shifted in my feet. Small improvements compounded. I stopped being automatically last. I won holes. I hit shots that made the air taste like electricity. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest when a ball rolled true, and I felt briefly almost proud. It was a small, private exhilaration I kept in the pocket of my cardigan like a coin. Instead of the easy camaraderie that used to greet those moments, 2 of the men in our group began to behave like I had taken something from them. The first morning after a match I had won, one of them snorted and said out loud, loud enough for the cart to hear, "You only beat us because of that handicap." Another muttered under his breath every time I claimed a birdie, like a ritual complaint. When I hit a bad shot, they did not sigh the way friends do. They laughed in that cold, sharp way that strips the joy from you. Social media began to distort our phraseology into screenshots of scorecards and thinly veiled messages, and a private group chat, something that had once held memes about our terrible putting, became the place where they debated whether my handicap was accurate, whether I was gaming the system. The conflict became not about strokes, but trust. I felt betrayed by people who were supposed to be friends. It felt stranger because their behavior wasn't explosive. It was small and methodical, like erosion. A whisper in the hallway, a raised eyebrow during a toast, a photograph posted with a caption that invited doubt. I wondered if I should quit next year's tournament, but walking away felt like conceding something I valued and letting their small cruelty win. The problem that grew was not just about golf. It was about how someone close can rewrite the rules of your belonging and make you doubt the ground you stand on. I did what I thought I could. I tried to solve it directly. The first thing I did was speak to the one player who had always been fair and kind. Over coffee one gray Tuesday, we went over the scorecards, looking for pattern and fairness. He listened with the patience of someone who likes spreadsheets and people both equally, and he suggested we all sit down after a round and talk openly about handicaps and expectations. I agreed, hopeful. I also tightened my game, taking lessons from a coach whose voice reminded me of a metronome, precise, unhurried, practicing posture and breath until familiar movements felt new again. I worked on being less emotional, convincing myself the problem was only about numbers. The first group meeting went poorly. The 2 men leaned into passive aggression instead of resolution. They raised their voices about fairness and rules, and the air tasted metallic and sour. One of them insisted loudly that the only way to fix things was my removal or recalibration, as if my presence were a bug in the system to be patched. The second began to joke about my wardrobe at the club, the way female golfers supposedly smile too much, jokes that were thinly veiled barbs. I felt small and foolish for thinking a conversation could right the course. Messages arrived after matches I did not want to read. Small jabs hidden in humor, gifs of people tripping, a screenshot of a scorecard with a question mark in the caption, "Did she get lucky?" At home, my chest tightened like a vice around a balloon. Sometimes I would press my palms to my sternum and count to 10 until the tightness loosened. I considered quitting outright. The idea of not being part of a thing that had been mine and my father's legacy stung like a slap, but staying risked months of microabuse. I brought it up to my father, who had always loved the game and who had organized parts of the tournament in past seasons. He listened and then, after a long pause, told me not to let others' pettiness ruin something I loved. That advice soothed for a night, but the reality remained. Two of the guys were actively hostile, and in private they were more corrosive than on the green. My attempts to improve and to use openness failed and made matters worse. Each victory turned into evidence for their complaints. I started to withdraw from the group chat. Friends I relied on during late nights of doubt said I should document the harassment and, if necessary, bring it to the club manager. I tried that next. I made a careful clinical report with times, quotes, and screenshots of the messages that felt cruel. I cataloged the slashed bag, how the cut ran along the seam, clean as if executed by someone who knew what they were doing, photographing the torn lining with my phone and storing the images in a folder labeled simply evidence. The club manager, an amiable woman with a posture practiced by diplomatic meetings, called them in for a neutral conversation. For a week I felt buoyant, like someone had finally heard the small, constant tapping of my distress and had turned the faucet. Then the backlash crested. The two men went quiet at the club, yes, but they started whispering in corners, posting subtle digs on their own social media that tagged the club in nostalgic posts about the old days before rules got weird, and the group chat, once a place for banter, became a theater of passive slights and resentment. One evening after a match, I walked back to the clubhouse and found my bag slashed, a clean line cut into the lining as if to say, "You are not welcome." The smell of rubber and damp fabric hit me like salt. My first thought was disbelief. My second was a cold, spreading certainty that leaving might be the only sane option. I felt betrayed by people who had called themselves friends, and I understood then how dangerous grudges can be when they are fed by entitlement and bruised pride. The low point came a week later when the two men confronted me near the ninth tee. I was alone, adjusting the tee, palms cold. They insisted, in voices that tried to be reasonable but were thinly veneered anger, that my handicap was unfair and that other players were complaining. They demanded a recalculation on the spot, a humbling public display. I remember the way the sun felt too bright, how the breeze smelled like cut grass and something metallic. My hands shook. I could hear the distant clack of a golf cart, and my chest felt hollow and urgent. For a moment I imagined leaving my clubs, turning my back and walking away, letting the tradition dissolve without contest. I felt utterly small. In that moment of near defeat, I realized something important. Every option carried consequence. Quitting would preserve my dignity from further daily mockery, but it would also hand them the victory they sought. Fighting in the clubroom would be a long, draining battle with uncertain victory, where the truth could be clouded by the same friends who had been swayed by easy jokes. I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be after all of this. I did not want to escalate to cruelty. I wanted a resolution that was precise and, if possible, poetic. I began to plan a final move that was not about humiliation, but about exposing the truth in a way they could not wriggle away from. I started by gathering more evidence. I redid every scorecard, archived emails about the tournament rules, and pulled public match data from the club's site. I secretly recorded conversations with their consent implied because they spoke openly in public spaces, and I kept backups of all the messages. I cross-referenced dates, conditions, and witness accounts the way I would triangulate user research. I built a timeline that showed progress, practice sessions, coach notes, and the gradual lowering of stroke averages that aligned with my documented practice. Where there were gaps, I reached out to other players I trusted to corroborate. I reached out to people who mattered in ways the two men had assumed they controlled: the club board, the club membership committee, and a local golf association that handled tournament integrity. I did not confront them with anger. I prepared a dossier the way I would prepare a product brief, clear, irrefutable, and calm. I asked for a formal review of handicaps and for the club to facilitate mediation. I wanted institutional clarity. If my handicap was wrong, adjust it. If not, let the record show that attempts to undermine me were unfounded. The day of the review was humid, the kind of Portland summer afternoon when the air feels slow and thick. The committee met in a glass room overlooking the second fairway. I sat at the long table with my copy of files and my sketchbook tucked beside it, my fingers tracing the edge of the pages like a ritual to steady myself. The two men were there, their faces tighter than I had ever seen, as if something of their control had been taken away. The committee asked questions, examined stroke histories, and looked at the patterns. The evidence was there. My improvements were consistent with practice and technique, not with manipulation. The board determined my handicap stood as it was. They also noted the messages and the slashed bag and said such behavior violated club standards. The club issued a formal warning to the two men and instituted mediation. I expected satisfaction and relief, but what washed over me was something quieter, a settling, like rain finally soaking into thirsty soil. The poetic consequence of my effort was not a public shaming or a triumphant speech. It was the restoration of my name with documentation and the formal recognition that patterns of petty entitlement were not acceptable. There was another consequence I had not anticipated. One of the two men who had been more aggressive resigned from the committee and left the club quietly. The other, who had been an echo of his friend, apologized in a text that read like a stranger's attempt to mimic contrition. "Hey Maya, sorry if things got weird, that was not cool." I read it, felt a brief flare of triumph, and then a wash of exhaustion. Justice does not erase the memory of being mocked. The final act had not been a dramatic confrontation on the green. It was the slow, steady amassing of facts, the refusal to let small cruelties be normalized. I walked away with my dignity and my clubs intact. The new normal is quieter and more deliberate. I still play, but I do not attend every annual match at the country club. I found alternative groups who treat the sport like the ritual of connection it should be. Laughter when you miss, honest cheers when you win, and no cheap shots when someone is trying. My relationship with my father changed too. He admitted later in a long phone call that he had not seen the way the other men had behaved and that he regretted it. We spent a weekend practicing together at a municipal course, the kind with old benches and less posturing. For the first time in years, we played without the heavy history pressing on our shoulders. We compared notes, his rougher, more seasoned instincts against my methodical charts, and we laughed about silly things we had taken too seriously. Those afternoons felt like replanting a root that had been disturbed. The resolution taught me something larger than golf. When those you trust weaponize tradition to protect their fragile egos, you can respond with clarity, records, and boundaries. It does not have to end in escalation or spectacle. Sometimes a quiet insistence on fairness is the most devastating form of revenge because it restores what was taken, a sense of belonging and truth. Revenge, in this sense, is not about cruelty. It is about reparation and reclamation. If you have been betrayed by a spouse or by close friends, by in-laws who undermine tradition, or by people who try to gaslight you out of your place, remember that revenge need not be crude. Document, appeal to systems that value fairness, and hold space for your own dignity. And if you have experienced a similar betrayal, share in the comments below.